They called it an apology, but it wasn't weakness. It was strategy. When Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before reporters and calmly said he'd personally apologized to Donald Trump, the headlines exploded. U.S. commentators mocked him. Pundits called it Canada bowing to Washington. But beneath that quiet tone was one of the sharpest diplomatic moves of our time, because Carney wasn't playing defense, he was playing chess. While the world saw us sorry, Carney saw leverage. That single gesture disarmed an American president addicted to outrage and turned humiliation into advantage. For decades, Canada's power abroad was measured by proximity to the United States. Now, it was being measured by something far more potent: restraint. Carney's calm didn't come from weakness. It came from knowing the rules of global politics had changed. In an age of noise, the man who stays silent longest wins. And when Carney stepped into Asia, every leader from Kuala Lumpur to Tokyo saw it, the poise of a statesman who doesn't need to shout to be heard. This wasn't an accident. It was years of observation, calculation, and quiet defiance built into one sentence. I called President Trump and apologized. The apology became a headline. The headline became a turning point. And from that moment, Canada's global reputation shifted from polite observer to master strategist. This is the story of how Mark Carney outplayed Donald Trump, not with anger, not with force, but with intelligence and timing. Welcome to Northern Pulse, where diplomacy meets power and the quietest moves echo the loudest. It began quietly, no fireworks, no shouting, no stage spectacle. Just a composed Canadian Prime Minister walking through Asia's corridors of power, shaking hands, and building something the world hadn't seen in years. Quiet credibility. From Kuala Lumpur to Tokyo, Mark Carney's Asia tour was supposed to be routine, a simple round of trade and diplomatic meetings. But what unfolded became a turning point for Canada's identity on the global stage. For decades, Canada's diplomacy had been defined by politeness, steady, reliable, but rarely bold. The world saw Canada as a bridge builder, never the architect, yet this time something was different. Carney wasn't just attending conferences, he was reshaping conversations. His speeches didn't echo American talking points, they introduced Canada's own vision: green energy partnerships, digital trade routes, and climate financing. Words that resonated across Asia, where nations were hungry for reliable Western partners who didn't carry Washington's baggage. At ASEAN and APEC, Carney didn't seek validation, he commanded respect. His presence projected confidence, not confrontation. For once, Canada wasn't standing beside a superpower, it was standing alone and stronger for it. Even seasoned diplomats whispered that this was a new Canada, one that understood influence isn't always measured by military power, but by moral and economic gravity. The shift was subtle yet seismic. The era of reactive diplomacy, waiting for Washington to move first, was ending. In its place stood a Canada unafraid to lead its own alliances. But just as Carney was rewriting the script abroad, a storm was brewing at home. An ad from Ontario intended as a political stunt would spiral into an international controversy, testing Carney's leadership and forcing him to make the most controversial move of his career. For most of its modern history, Canada's foreign policy revolved around a simple truth: whatever happened in Washington echoed in Ottawa. Trade, tariffs, defense, even diplomacy were often dictated by America's interests. That relationship worked as long as stability ruled the White House. But when Donald Trump arrived with his doctrine of America first, the foundation cracked. Overnight, allies became targets, and Canada, once shielded by friendship, found itself facing economic fire. Carney, unlike most politicians, had lived through global chaos. As former head of the Bank of England, he understood how quickly markets and alliances could collapse. Trump's tariff wars taught him an expensive lesson. Dependence is danger. Canada had placed too many of its eggs in one basket, and Washington had just dropped it. That realization sparked what would later be called Canada's awakening. Under Carney's leadership, Ottawa began diversifying trade beyond North America. Asia wasn't just a backup plan, it became the main stage. Green energy partnerships with Japan, agricultural pacts with Malaysia, and digital infrastructure projects with South Korea began taking shape. For the first time, Canada was crafting its own global blueprint. Carney's message to Trump, though never spoken directly, was clear: we have options. Those 4 words carried weight far beyond their simplicity. They told the world that Canada would no longer be trapped by geography or politics. And as Carney toured Asia, nations listened. To them, he represented a kind of leadership missing in global politics: calm, intelligent, and deeply strategic. But back home, that message of independence collided with something far more volatile. A provincial government ad mocking U.S. tariffs would ignite a diplomatic firestorm, forcing Carney to prove that true power isn't loud, it's controlled. It started as a local stunt, a flashy confrontational ad released by Ontario's provincial government. Its message, a direct jab at Trump's trade policy. The ad mocked American tariffs, portraying them as greedy and self-destructive. For Ontario's populist politicians, it was red meat for voters. But within 24 hours, that regional soundbite turned into an international incident. American networks picked it up, branding it an official Canadian insult. Social media exploded. U.S. commentators accused Canada of hypocrisy. And then came the breaking headline. Trump suspends all trade talks with Canada. It didn't matter that the ad wasn't from Carney's office. Perception had already taken root. Canada looked like it had taken a swing. The timing couldn't have been worse. Carney was in Tokyo, closing energy and green technology discussions with Japanese ministers. Suddenly, every question from reporters wasn't about Asia but about the ad. Would Carney condemn it, defend it, stay silent? His response could redefine the fragile balance he had just built. Advisors urged caution. Party insiders begged him not to appear weak before Trump. But Carney didn't see this as a political trap, he saw an opportunity. He understood what the Americans didn't. Diplomacy isn't about ego, it's about outcome. Defending the ad would earn applause at home but destroy trust abroad. Ignoring it would signal weakness. There was only one path left, something counterintuitive, something bold. Carney quietly told his staff, "We'll take responsibility even if it's not ours." No one knew exactly what he meant. But a few days later, the meaning became clear, when Carney stood before the nation and uttered a single sentence that stunned both Ottawa and Washington. He said, "I've personally called President Trump and I apologized." When Mark Carney stepped in front of the cameras, the press expected him to dodge responsibility. After all, the anti-tariff ad wasn't his doing, it came from Ontario's provincial government. But instead of deflecting, Carney leaned forward, adjusted his notes, and delivered a sentence that sent shockwaves through the global media. "I've personally called President Trump and apologized." The room fell silent. Then came the storm. Reporters rushed to file headlines that read, "Carney bows to Trump and Canada surrenders." Opposition leaders accused him of weakness. American pundits mocked the Canadian apology reflex. Even within his own party, eyebrows rose. But Carney's calm never cracked. Because he knew something others didn't. This wasn't about politics, it was about positioning. The ad had already exposed Trump's tariffs as self-defeating. Keeping the fight alive would only escalate tensions. So Carney chose a move that disarmed Washington completely. His apology wasn't submission, it was strategy. By taking responsibility for something he didn't cause, Carney shifted the moral spotlight. Suddenly, Trump looked like the aggressor, and Carney looked like the adult in the room. Diplomats immediately recognized the brilliance. The apology neutralized Trump's outrage and reopened communication channels that had frozen for months. Even critics began to concede it worked. Carney's tone, humble but firm, reframed power. He wasn't chasing approval, he was commanding respect through composure. It was a rare act of diplomatic aikido, using Trump's aggression against him. By the time Washington realized what had happened, the narrative had already changed. Trump looked petty. Carney looked presidential. And just like that, one apology reshaped an entire relationship and redefined what leadership looked like in an era obsessed with noise. What looked like humility was, in truth, precision. Mark Carney didn't stumble into that apology, he engineered it. Every pause, every word, every glance was rehearsed in the language of power. Carney had studied Trump long before stepping into office. He knew how the former U.S. president operated, a man driven by ego, headlines, and dominance. Trump believed control came from confrontation. Carney believed it came from composure, so he flipped the script. Instead of trading insults, Carney offered calm. Instead of shouting louder, he whispered wisely. He didn't try to match Trump's energy, he redirected it. It was psychological chess, a master at diplomacy using silence as his checkmate. Trump's advisors were blindsided. They had prepared for outrage, not courtesy. Within hours, Washington was scrambling to adjust its tone. The American president couldn't retaliate without looking childish. How do you attack someone who just apologized with dignity? Carney had trapped him with grace. Behind closed doors, Canadian strategists called it the smile strategy. They understood that the apology wasn't about forgiveness. It was about freezing escalation. By appearing soft, Carney made it impossible for Trump to stay aggressive without alienating his own allies. And while pundits debated, Carney moved quietly. He reactivated trade back channels through Canadian diplomats and U.S. industry lobbyists. Talks that had been dead were suddenly in progress. Trump's outrage dominated social media. Carney's restraint dominated results. This was never about winning an argument, it was about winning the long game. And Carney, a man of markets and logic, knew exactly how patience could become a weapon. Because in a world that rewards noise, true power belongs to the one who knows when to stay silent. and when to smile. While Washington struggled to interpret Carney's apology, Asia understood it instantly. To leaders across Tokyo, Seoul, and Beijing, what Carney had done wasn't weakness, it was mastery. In their eyes, he embodied something the Western world often forgets: diplomacy as discipline. His calm, calculated apology reflected the same principles Asian states respect: patience, humility, and control. And that made him more respected, not less. In Tokyo, Japan's foreign ministry praised Carney's restraint as leadership. In Seoul, trade officials noted that he'd accomplished what no one else had managed, de-escalating a U.S. trade feud without losing dignity. Even in Beijing, state media subtly applauded Canada's new approach, describing it as balanced, principled, and pragmatic. But this wasn't just about perception. Behind closed doors, real deals were forming. Carney's meetings in Malaysia and Singapore finalized new frameworks for clean energy and digital connectivity. South Korea expressed interest in joint battery production for electric vehicles. Japan pushed for joint technology investments. Every handshake told the same story: Canada had become Asia's trusted Western partner. For decades, countries in the Pacific had looked at North America and seen volatility. With Carney, they saw predictability. They saw a man who could bridge East and West without picking sides. Ironically, Carney's apology to Trump became the reason Asian partners doubled down on Canada. They saw maturity in the face of chaos. They saw strength in composure. When Carney returned home, the headlines in Asia didn't say "Prime Minister apologizes." They said something else entirely: Canada leads by example. The world was shifting. And as Washington stewed in confusion, Asia had already chosen its next ally, the quiet nation that had just outsmarted America's loudest voice. In Washington, Carney's apology had first been mocked as political theater, the Canadian way of crawling back. But within a week, the laughter faded. The markets told a different story. U.S. agricultural lobbies, automakers, and manufacturing groups quietly began urging the White House to reopen trade discussions. Trump's tariffs had already strained supply chains and raised prices for American consumers, and Carney's gesture had made one thing clear: Canada was willing to talk, the U.S. wasn't, and that politically looked terrible. By neutralizing the drama, Carney flipped the optics. Suddenly, the chaos wasn't coming from Ottawa, it was coming from Washington. Inside the Beltway, analysts from the Brookings Institution and Council on Foreign Relations began calling his apology a tactical olive branch, a move that forced America to appear unreasonable if it didn't respond. Even conservative U.S. columnists admitted begrudgingly that Carney had outclassed Trump. Behind closed doors, a quiet panic set in. Trump's advisors wanted retaliation, but there was no opening. Canada's tone was too civil, its diplomacy too precise. Any aggressive move would make the U.S. look unstable on the world stage, something even Trump's donors feared. Meanwhile, back-channel meetings resumed under the radar. Canadian and American negotiators began exchanging drafts of updated trade frameworks. Washington lobbyists close to the auto and steel industries pushed to end the stalemate, citing Carney's apology as the reason dialogue was politically safe again. What began as a moment of supposed surrender had turned into silent dominance. In just 10 days, Carney's calm dismantled Trump's rage-fueled strategy. The American president wanted confrontation, Carney gave him none. And in that void, Washington saw what it truly feared: a Canada that no longer needed permission to lead.